Welcome to the session of the Perimenopause Revolution. I am Wendy, your host and your expert today. So I'm excited to talk about this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. And without further ado, and we're going to get into it. So, the title of this is Staying Calm. And one of the things that I see all the time out in social media and everything else is talking about nervous system regulation. I myself know about nervous system regulation. I'm a trauma informed coach. This is language that is really big, pretty much everywhere, and especially if you're a coach. And so, one of the things I find is that there's a whole bunch of mixed up messages. And when it comes to nervous system regulation, people kind of gloss over it quite a bit. They will talk maybe about some theories and they'll explain some things, but they don't really talk about the components of it. So this session's going to get kind of deep in certain things and you can't get deep enough in others. It's a really complicated conversation, but I'm going to do my best to try to keep it all kind of cohesive for you. And I will say that if you're familiar with the stuff that I do, we are not going to be going through the stress responses. So I'm going to be talking about stress generally here. And I might mention some things, but I highly recommend you also watch my 5 ways to regulate your nervous system to get a better understanding about stress responses. So really what we're talking about is there's 4 main things that cause nervous system nervous system dysregulation. Basically, when you're stressed and you're overwhelmed and you can't quite, you know, do what you want it is that you want to do. So number one is that there's an absence of someone else to help you co-regulate with. So as infants, and actually not just as infants, as mammals, this is a phenomenon across all mammals. We all co-regulate together. This is what mammals do. This is one of the reasons why pets are really helpful to people, because your nervous system and their nervous system are co-regulating together. Why they're so good for trauma, like people who've experienced PTSD and things of that nature. It's because the pets kind of help build in some nervous system regulation. Now, a lot of times our stressors in life are people, and they're obviously usually dysregulated. And so we're not being surrounded by a bunch of people that are co-regulated. And then our resource depletion. So basically like the energy that we have in our body is depleted. And then, the circumstances exceeds our capacity, meaning we don't really know what to do in the situation. And we're just trying to rely on maybe not some useful tools. And then, chronic activation, meaning like a lot of times there's these patterns that we repeat over and over again. And they're usually learned patterns from when we were children that were adaptive when we were young and then haven't become adaptive as an adult. All right. Before we get into how self-regulation is a learned skill, I want to give you a little bit about my background and kind of why I'm here and how I got to this point so you can understand why everything going forward makes sense and where I'm coming from. So I'm a mom of 2 kids. So my older son, Milan, is a quote unquote normal developing teenager at this point. And my younger son, Max, has a brain injury since birth. And he has the brain injury that affects like muscle movement and speech, but he also has a global developmental delay. So I like to think of him as a toddler with 13 years of experience. And so one of the things that is really clear as you start understanding, trauma and stress and all of those patterns is that when we look at how most of us are raised. Now, obviously, I don't know your whole life history. I'm going to be very general here. So if this doesn't apply to you, know that can only be general in this discussion. Most people who are brought up in the West have a lot of similarities in the way that they're brought up. And consistently across the board, what I've seen through myself and my clients and lots of other people is that we are brought up in a way where our caregivers are asking us to change our behavior. Just calm down. So that's why we have the title of this today. And what they're really asking for, something that I call a difference between a want and a need. That's a whole different conversation, but just to kind of break it down, like the caregiver stress, like we'll use my kids as an example. They're running around, they're yelling. And I'm like, oh my God, just stop, right? they're just playing and they're doing their thing, or maybe they're upset. And so, like, when it comes to Max, this would happen a lot. Max would get upset, you get frustrated because he's not able to communicate or move or all of the different things that are going on with him. And he would have lots of outbursts, just like a toddler does. And unlike my older son, who I could have a conversation with him, some days I could be like, are you tired? Are you hungry? Are you this? Are you that? Like, what's going on? Did you have a bad dream? All of the different ways in which we communicate. And then, of course, there are the other days where I was like, oh my God, just stop. Like, I can't deal with this right now. Mommy's stressed out. I started to get better and I'd be like, mommy's tired or I'm hungry. Like, I would start kind of acknowledging what was wrong with me. So that way he could help adjust his behavior to help kind of meet my wants. But really, what my needs were something deeper underneath that. My nervous system was dysregulated and I didn't know how to regulate it. And so I was asking like my kids or the world or my partner or my boss or coworker or friends, whatever, you're wanting other people to change their behavior so you feel better. And so this is not nervous system regulation. That is other people changing their behavior. Now, a lot of times people will just remove themselves from that. Obviously, there are times when that's important, safety, all of that stuff. But in general, you're still not regulating your nervous system. And so with Max, I knew I needed to figure this out because it wasn't going to get easier. And in fact, as I said, he's 13 years old, right? So he's got toddler with 13 years of experience. Imagine a toddler going through hormonal changes and not having the social skills and ability to be able to, you know, change his behavior because his mother's, overwhelmed, right? So that kind of brings me to why I'm here and why I personally went on this kind of path or quest to figure out nervous system regulation. I figured out a lot of things along the way, and that's why, we're kind of here today. So what we think of as nervous system regulation is really self-regulation. And this is a very new skill. So ideally, we would have caregivers, parents, community, where they would be regulated. And as children, we actually basically we mirror back the nervous systems of our caregivers. It's, part like we understand this now in neuroscience. We have these things called mirror neurons. And it's a really useful skill. Without even any understanding of the world, babies and toddlers will change their nervous system to match the nervous system of their parents. And so I have watched this over and over again with Max. And once it kind of clicked, that's when I realized I really needed to figure out some of this, right? Because for Max, I still to this day, even though our communication's getting better, I basically need to regulate my nervous system in order for his nervous system to change. I cannot talk him out of his dysregulated nervous system. That's not going to happen. And I can't even get him to maybe do a breathing exercise like I could with my older son or do some kind of something, right? Because he doesn't understand what's going on. His nervous system requires, regulated people around him, right? Okay, so as babies, as infants, we would learn this. Now, most of us do not grow up with regulated, caregivers. I can tell you with certainty, looking back, it's not very regulated at all. I mean, there was times, obviously, there's going to be times where we're all regulated, but there was a lot of dysregulation in my childhood. And, as you kind of learn it, you practice it, right? So you practice whatever the skills of regulation you learn as a young child, as you go through especially from age 7 to 14, you're basically practicing a bunch of that nervous system regulation skills. By the time you're about 14, this is when there's a different shift in like your developmental biology. And instead of it being more internal, you start wanting friends and trying to figure out where we fit into the world. But, with that nervous system regulation, a lot of those patterns are pretty much are very entrenched. I don't want to say they're set because that's not the way our brains work. We can always change, which is why we're here, or at least why I'm here is to tell everybody that we can change. And so all of this that we're talking about, all the pieces of it, they are changeable, right? And so learned, practiced, and earned. And so we can develop the skills of self-regulation. And if I could do it, I swear I'm not like some super human, right? Especially people who knew me in my 20s, like, you know how dysregulated I was for a very, very long time in my life, self-regulation skills. So, you know, as I said, we would have normally kind of grown up with people who are more regulated. And this being like a new, you can kind of think of self regulation or nervous system regulation as this kind of new emerging skill because traditionally we all lived in larger communities. And it wasn't even that long ago that we still had smaller, close knit communities that we could lean on, maybe not on a daily basis, maybe going into town to go to a religious service or going into town to, spend the day there. So I live in the United States. So like maybe you would live out in the countryside and you would go in on your wagons into town. You don't just like go grab something and go back home, right? Like, they're spending the whole day there. They're restocking. They're really getting into that community. And then if you want to go even back, farther to more tribal communities, we definitely sat around campfires. And even if you're thinking about living on the countryside, for the most part, people had larger families. So there was a lot of community always going around. And, there was all these opportunities to co-regulate with other people. Now, co-regulation works both ways. It can dysregulate you as well as regulate you. This is a useful thing. Imagine you're sitting around a campfire in a tribe and the crazy guy of the village comes running in and says, "Oh, we're under attack." Everyone just kind of goes, ha, 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 and like goes on with their way because they know that like this person maybe isn't, quite with the reality. But if it's like the person that is guarding, the perimeter comes running in and says, "Hey, we're under attack," everyone's going to shift. And this is a very useful skill. So now kind of bringing it back to the topic of hand and why it's here in a part of this summit is depending on when you're watching this, if this is the first one you're watching, just know that little bits and pieces get brought up in parts throughout the other summit sessions. But one of the things that's pretty clear about the science when you start kind of really looking into what menopause actually is. Menopause is when your body has accumulated, more stress energy than is processed. And so stress energy comes into our body. We ingest energy in multiple ways: physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and social. Energy comes in all of those different ways. And we ingest it, meaning it doesn't necessarily mean like through your mouth. The term of ingestion just means to take in, right? So that energy is ingested into our system, and then it has to be processed and it has to be expelled because energy cannot be created or destroyed. It just gets transformed. But most people are not living in lifestyles that allow them to process their stress energy. And so we accumulate the stress. And this is basically what aging is. Aging is accumulated stress throughout different parts of your body and your cells. And so menopause is when the body has accumulated so much stress that it no longer can sustain producing life, because 3D printing a human is a pretty intensive process. And so it will shut down the reproductive system. Now, this is the reason why it's pretty clear that it's related to stress. Number one, that's what aging is, right? Aging is, more stress that has been accumulated. Number two, if you ask lots of people about early menopause, it all happens around a stressful event. And so, obviously people who have menopause much later in life, theirs might be more of that accumulative effect. Whereas the early onset menopause, it's always tied to some stressful experience in life. And so we need to start kind of looking at perimenopause as our body is starting to hold too much stress energy and we need to process it. And so that is really kind of at the heart of all of this. And so we talk about stress, and there's a lot of talk about cortisol and hormones, right? So these are, the catchphrases. Definitely go check out Rosemary's session when she talks about cortisol. But, hormones are talked about all throughout it. I remember Zora talked about, Zora talked about it, Bridge talked about, a bunch of people. We talk about it because, hormones are kind of one of the things that we notice because it's a symptom of what's going on in our nervous system. This is why it's important for this conversation. And so I want to kind of put a couple things in here and why this is so important to kind of understand nervous system regulation and how impactful getting stress, kind of managing stress and really working on this component is when it comes to like perimenopause and eventually menopause. So cortisol, as we know, is the stress hormone. And so the reason why it's so impactful during this time period, number one, estrogen is really important. There are estrogen receptor cells all throughout the body. Estrogen is responsible for hydration. So this probably doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of you. You might have heard about vaginal dryness or dry eyes, like all the dryness happens. Estrogen helps with hydration, but it's not just the hydration in the skin, it's actually the cellular hydration as well. And this is really, really important. If you understand how cell replication occurs, mitochondria need water in order to basically create enough energy for cell duplication, replication. If there is not enough water, meaning you're dehydrated, those cells are going to replicate incorrectly. Now, we've got a great system called autophagy that will help us kind of clear out these cells. But if your cells are replicating incorrectly at a rate faster than the amount of time you're spending in autophagy, then those incorrectly replicated cells are going to start replicating and duplicating. And this really is what cancer is. I mean, not all cancers, there's a whole bunch of cancers, but in general, the vast majority of cancers have to do with replicating cells that are incorrect, right? So the DNA did not get raveled and raveled correctly. And a lot of this can be tied to hydration and mitochondrial function. Having the proper amounts of estrogen is really important for that mitochondrial function, for the hydration, for the mitochondria to work. And estrogen is a very interesting thing because have you ever heard of this thing called adipose or fat? So estrogen is needed for this whole entire process, right? Throughout your body. It's really important for heart health, circulatory system, pretty much any parts that are really needing that flow in blood and water and hydration. Estrogen is really important to that system. If you're starting to get low on estrogen, your body's like, hey, we need to store estrogen. So the body stores it into fat. So you may not realize this, but every fat cell has the ability to make estrogen for your well-being. So if you think about when you age, right? Why do so many older, like really older people, why do they get so thin? Right? It's because the body is taking the estrogen out of the fat cells because it is needed throughout the body, right? So this accumulation that a lot of women experience during perimenopause of the different fat, especially in different areas that they're not used to, this has to do with the estrogen lowering and the cortisol is because there's too much cortisol and it's signaling to store the estrogen into the fat cells because it's not just that there's the estrogen. So sometimes what happens, people have an estrogen dominance kind of thing going on. It's actually because cortisol suppresses testosterone. So testosterone we kind of think of as like, you know, motivation and different things, but we do know it's like muscle mass, right? It's really important for muscle mass and bone density. And so it's really about how so our muscles are one of the biggest like utilizers of energy, right? Well, if we're having energy depleted, we're like, wait, we got to shrink our muscle down because this needs to be balanced, right? But the cortisol suppresses the testosterone. And so then when there's low levels of testosterone and there's high levels of cortisol, that's when the estrogen gets stored into the fat cells. And so this cortisol, has this huge impact. And then on top of it, cortisol, in order to make it, the precursor to it is something called pregnenolone. So pregnenolone is also the precursor to progesterone. And so progesterone, we've heard about it. This really is like the feel-good hormone. I know a lot of times it gets attached to like estrogen, but it's really progesterone. So if you have known anyone who's pregnant or you yourself might have gone through pregnancy, there's like a time period where the progesterone is rising and you feel better. You may feel uncomfortable in your body, but your mood stabilizes. And a lot of that has to do with progesterone. Now, as someone who works a lot with people with ADHD, I have ADHD myself. This is a really important thing to understand is that progesterone isn't the precursor to dopamine, but it is essential for the production of dopamine. So if there are low levels of progesterone, you're not going to produce enough dopamine. And so this is one of the reasons why so many women during perimenopause all of a sudden, quote unquote, have ADHD. ADHD is not the root cause. ADHD are symptoms. So pretty much everything that's going on in your body is actually a reflection of the state of your nervous system in the past. Your hormone levels, the way you're behaving, all of this stuff, it all has to do with your nervous system. Once you kind of grasp this and see it, you will never unsee it again. So cortisol is really important for managing your hormone levels, stress, understanding stress. And so this is dealing about, you know, nervous system regulation. So what really does that mean? We talked a little about dysregulation and what happens. So there are four components to nervous system regulation. One is co-regulation. As I said, we evolved around this. We are mammals. We are designed to co-regulate. It is by far the fastest, quickest, easiest way to regulate your nervous system is to be around someone else who is regulated. But if it's your son Max and he's completely dysregulated, then that option is no longer available and you will have to rely on some of the other self-regulation behaviors. And so a big part of that is energetic resources. This is the term that I like to use. If you read the book, How Emotions Are Made by Lisa Feldman Barrett, she talks about body budget. I've heard it called a couple of different things. I just always say energetic resources. It's the one that makes the most sense to me. So we're talking about the resources, the energetic resources available. So that way we can process all of the energy that's coming into our body, right? And so our environmental signals, so our external or internal environment are going to be sending signals. So externally, we kind of get it, like what's going on, the stressors in life, the people around you, those are definitely your environmental. But the internal stressors, so much of it has to do with digestion. So much of it has to do with digestion. It is pretty much all anxiety actually comes from digestion. This is an Ayurvedic understanding. And when you kind of go into the science of it, it all makes sense. So, like, if you think about it, if you're not processing well, then you're not, something's off, right? Like maybe you're not absorbing the nutrients that you need to be able to do other functions, or it's just slow and stagnant. And so there's an uncomfortableness that is going on inside of you. You might have been ignoring it for years. You may have had lots of digestive issues your entire life and maybe not have realized it. I mean, most people kind of do, but not everyone does. But if your system is going to be sending signals that things are wrong. And if you're in this habit of suppressing the signals from your body, this is called dissociation. If you get in that habit, our minds then kind of assign this feeling that something is wrong to the external environment. So we want our internal environment to be healthy. We want our external environment to be healthy as well. Now, obviously, you can't change everything in your life and monitor and control everything. It's really about capacity, right? So we want to kind of get our environment, external, internal, as good as possible, give us the right energetic resources, try to be around regulated people as much as possible. And then that way we can use the right tool at the right time. And understanding the right tools at the right time is kind of like the part to this. So when we're thinking about well-being, this is kind of easy, but also it doesn't give you necessarily a path to figure it out. So this is kind of my path to help people figure out well-being. These are really sometimes I talk about just the 5 S's. It depends on how quickly I'm talking to people, but really it's these 7 S's. So number 1, social connection. We just talked about this, right? So really, being around and curating situations where you can co-regulate with other people is really going to help your health and well-being. This is not a nicety in life. It is a necessity. So we are meant to be around regulated people. Sun is obviously, like, you probably have heard of sunlight and needing vitamin D, but really I want you to think about sun being this like connection to nature, because all life on this planet evolved to be able to basically handle the radiation from sunlight. All of everything in this world has a biological rhythm that is set from the sun. And that also includes the moon as well, because the moon reflects light at different times. Like a new moon, there's no light from the sun being reflected down to the earth. Whereas during the full moon, you've got a bunch of light being reflected down to the earth and vice versa. So your sunlight shifts through the moon, not only through the seasons, right? So there's like a lunar cycle and a larger cycle as well. Just know that the planets, they do actually have an impact on us. Is, however you want to describe it and talk about it is a different thing. All right. And then one of the other important things to think about sunlight too. So it's not even just sunlight, it's all light, right? But sunlight in particular is this really important kind of component to our life. So you might have heard of melatonin, which we're going to talk a little about in sleep, but really understanding why this is important. Melatonin is kind of like the master, like of the hormone regulators. So all of our cells have have receptors on them, like a different kind of UV receptor throughout your body. There are little lights that are going off all through our body. So our cells communicate through light. And so when you are in sunlight or moonlight or red light or blue light, your skin is taking in that information. Like we can think of it as data or information from that light, and it's getting into the cells. And then through your blood circulatory system, it is moving that light to all the parts of your body. There's light going off in the digestive system. There's light going off in all of the parts of your body. Like when you start understanding the importance of light. And so understanding that it's not just light, it's this like getting in sync with nature, right? That's what we are. We are a part of nature. We are not separate from nature, right? So this component of sun is really understanding our own rhythms, like our biological rhythms, our infradian rhythms, the circadian rhythms. We want to kind of get those in sync. And melatonin is going to play a key factor in this because it is what helps regulate and kind of signals what's going on. So there's basically two signals in your body that everything is a downstream effect from. One is stress. So like if your mind is interpreting the situation as stressful, meaning, like whatever it is, whether it's an internal or external environmental thing, and then the light, the melatonin that's going on, either you're awake or you're asleep. With those two, and then with the energetic resources available, your brain figures out what should be done. Everything is dependent on whether you're awake, asleep, or stressed or not, and then the amount of energetic resources you have available, and whether or not someone is there to help you co-regulate. Sleep, right? So we just talked about melatonin, but it's really important to know that there's like three major things that happen during sleep. One is restoration. So like our growth hormone, tissue repair, mitochondrial health. If you do not sleep, your body cannot restore its health. We have to go through this process of restoration. Like if you think about a muscle, muscles get stronger, they kind of break and repair, break and repair. We go through this every night. You can think of this also as a breath. Like you take a breath in while you're awake and while you're asleep, you're breathing out, right? They're both important. Everything has a balance and a rhythm to it. Our sleep requires this restoration process. And then there's the detoxification component of it. So remember, we're going to be processing energy. We're going to be repairing things. There's things going on. There's a whole bunch of like biochemical waste that happens from all of those chemical processes. And especially in the brain, like if you're an overthinker, there is a lot of basically neuro waste floating around your brain that needs to be removed. It only gets removed through the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system connects to the lymphatic, and it only happens when we're asleep or also in non-sleep deep rest. So if you watch the session with Dana, where we talk about non-sleep deep rest, we mentioned that a little bit as well. And so that lymphatic system will activate and it will push the neurotoxins out of your nervous system into the lymphatic system so they can be removed from your body. And so also inflammation modulation happens during that. And then additionally, mental and emotional processing happen during this. So everything that happens during the day, during the sleep spindles at night, all that information comes together. I like to think of it as there's a body snapshot and a mental snapshot, and they kind of come together. Just know that mental and emotional processing happens during certain stages of sleep. And without that, you will not be able to process your emotions or get clear in your mind and your thoughts. And this is basically what PTSD is. So PTSD occurs when people's sleep is disrupted and they're not able to process the emotion. So that stress energy is not able to be processed, right? So sleep. Then we have sustenance. This is one of the ones that I think a lot of people need to focus on. And so there's a few kind of components of it. I like to think about sustenance and looking at the five elements from the traditional Chinese medicine. So we've got the earth, which has got like our nutrients and our vitamins, but it's also our microbiomes. Like we've got a gut microbiome, a skin microbiome. We've got an entire fungal system inside of us. Like we are a part of nature, right? Like we need earth cooperation with earth, right? And so we do this through this process of, ingesting our food, right? And then we also have air though, oxygen. Like we know we need oxygen, like we need air, we need breath, we need to have this flow of oxygen. Definitely check out the pelvic floor session with Jana where we talk about this, or I think you should do both because Jen talks about pelvic floor, and then also with Terry when we talk about breath work. Also, I think Zora and I also talk about breath work as well. It's really important to understand, like, we know we need oxygen, right? And then water, hydration, mitochondrial function and health. I just talked a little bit about that. Absolutely essential that we have it. And then, the fire calories. Like if you think about what calories are, so let's just take plants for the first part of it. So plants go through the process of photosynthesis, taking the sunlight, and it converts it into stored energy. And that is what we're eating, right? Where if it's an animal, it's the melatonin that is taking and processing, the sunlight. Now, another kind of cool thing about melatonin that I forgot to mention is that melatonin is is also the part that's kind of responsible for taking everything that's like scattered, so like scattered thinking, and kind of collapses it down. Right, so fire is the converted sunlight. And then we have metal. And so, as I said, traditional Chinese medicine, they have this thing, metal. And this, we still need this. We can think of this as like the trace minerals and metals, like we need iron and copper and zinc and selenium and a whole bunch of other things. These are still a really important part. And like our whole body, functions, we need all of these five elements. Like this is how your energetic resources are really, created. And so, it's really important. And obviously check out the session with Bridge for nutrition. Also, Anjali, we talk a little bit about that as well. I think also with Rosemary, you want to check out like your nutrition part of it. And then supplements. So, obviously, in ideal world, we would get the right amount of sunlight, we'd get the right amount of sleep, we'd be connected to nature, our water would be clean, our air would be clean, our food would be clean, but it's not. We've got a lot of toxins in our body. Food, our soil is depleted. I know I talked about that with Andrea, in particular, talking about magnesium. Sometimes we really do need kind of this bridge from the situation of our reality. And it's going to be different for everybody. Everyone has different bodies, but just know that like supplements play an important role, and they always have. Like if you go back through modern times, there's always been remedies for when you get a cold or when you've got a cut or a wound or something. Like there's always been a way that we have supplemented our nutrition and our energetic resources, right? So, supplements are not something to be scared of, but they're definitely something to be explored. And, hopefully go do that with some guidance, because some of them can really not work well with your body. And it's important to do lab work. I know I talked about with Anjali, Dr. Molly. Um, and I think in Shebang, Lori and Dodie, they have a free thing where they talk about like how to talk to your doctor. Just know that there's ways to get supplements. And then also medication, depending on the medication and how it's used, just know that whatever the diagnosis is it's a diagnosis of something that's going wrong with your body. Medication usually doesn't get to the root of what is causing the imbalance. And it will be more like a Band-Aid or a supplement, the bridge medication usually functions more like a Band-Aid. If there's a big oozing, bleeding wound underneath there and you're not doing anything to actually change, if it's getting infected and you're not cleaning it out and getting to it, a Band-Aid is not going to help, right? And so sometimes it can, when you come off your medications, you may find that things are a lot worse because it's been hiding what the real symptoms were underneath there. And then we have the social identity component of this. Do not overlook this. This is super important. Self-expression, social identity, these are a part of being human. We are meant to be in community. So like having your purpose. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to mean a career. Whatever your purpose is, like really leaning into that and discovering that. Joy, absolutely essential. When you are experiencing joy, you're sending signals of safety through your body. So the more you get to practice experiencing joy, the better it is for your nervous system. And then awe, there's so much cool research on awe. I love the research of Lisa Miller, where she talks about the science of spirituality. Like, and Brained is a great book. But just know that like the things that you can do that can inspire awe are really beneficial. In the psychedelic space, this is something that's actually gets overlooked a lot because like psychedelics, they have a tendency to talk about the healing modalities, but there's a lot to be said for the awareness and awe of the spiritual component that happens with psychedelics, because we are hardwired to experience awe. And when we do that, it helps our regulate our nervous system. So this is one of the reasons why I definitely I've looked a lot into it. And then also understanding curiosity and creativity, trying to be creative. I like saying curiosity, but you can also say creativity. So whichever one feels good to you. Because when you're curious about something, you're like exploring and trying to figure things out, right? And you can be creative in so many different ways. Like cooking is a creative experience. Cleaning could be a curious experience, right? It's more about that shift in your brain. And when you do that, you're regulating your nervous system. So there's a couple little hints there to understanding it. And then also, I really recommend people do some of the deeper work to look into the things that cause them shame and guilt. A lot of it is based on society and narratives that we've gotten from other people. And a lot of times it's not even things that we believe anymore, but it's just really deep in there. And so then last but not least is self-partnership. This is where you kind of put it all together, where you fully support yourself and you really create those plans. You look at what's going on with yourself physically, sun, sleep, sustenance, supplements, mentally, like tracking your patterns, shifting narrative, neuro-linguistic programming, all of that kind of stuff, emotional embodiment work, somatic work, an important part to understand about emotions. Emotions really are the language that the body and the mind use to speak to each other spiritually. So when we get still and we reduce stress and we feel safe, we can access different parts of our brain. We can access maybe different states of consciousness, like through meditation, through trance, through shamanic practices, psychedelics. Like there's a whole bunch of different ways in which you can experience this spirituality. Once again, kind of talking about that social identity and the awe. How do you bring that in? Like what feels good to you as a person in society, right? So understanding who you are and what feels comfortable to you. And then social, like understanding your needs versus wants. I talked a little bit about that at the beginning. When you understand your wants and needs, it really helps you get clear on what your boundaries are then. Otherwise, boundaries are very difficult. And then also understanding belonging, that ties into like the purpose. And just as a reminder for anybody who is watching this, pleasure is the fastest way to change any neurological pattern, right? So like all of our behavior patterns, pleasure is the quickest way. Pleasure, like be stressed or not stressed, right? And if you're focusing on avoiding stress, you're still looking at the stress, right? So really the key is to kind of create these different kind of practices and components in your life that really, help you develop your purpose, bring in moments of awe, bring in moments of joy. These are really going to help you be a whole, complete person, and it will be quicker. And then last but not least, part of this is like self-compassion to this. Like people have different definitions of this. Inner child work and shadow work are two of my favorites. Inner child work really kind of talks about the parts of us that felt neglected. Shadow work is now taking the parts that either were neglected because other people neglected them or because we ourselves have either been embarrassed of them or didn't want them. Sometimes they're even like, aspects of ourselves that we find good, but we haven't figured out how to integrate them. So developing, self-compassion as you're integrating all the different parts of yourself is going to be really important. So, just as a reminder, like your body is wise. Your body knows exactly what to do. Stress is basically, feedback, right? Like it's a signal that there is something that you need to take action on. That's really the foundation of stress is like something you need to take action of that is uncertain. So there's like a component of uncertainty to stress because sometimes we need to take action on something, but it's certain, right? So now, that could be a joyful experience or purposeful or curiosity, right? So then it's not stressful, right? So it's that taking action on uncertainty that really creates the stressful moments. And so your stress response, all of them, however they show up, they're like your behavior on those, watch that video. It's like the way we're designed. And then understanding emotions as language, as I said, it's how your body and your mind communicate. So your body's got a bunch of internal things going on there, and the mind is looking at the external, and emotions are kind of what bring the internal and external environment together in a way where then the internal can go, okay, I know what's going on here. And the interpretation of external events can go, okay, I know what's going on with the body. This is how emotions are what drives our behavior. And so then it's about building capacity. So support and rhythm, getting in nature's rhythms, all of those, you know, looking at like how your energetic resources are there. And that's going to require sun and sleep and the five elements, right? And the supplements, the bridge that brings it together. And then last but not least, the self-partnership part, right? So support through self-compassion. All right. I hope you got a lot out of that. You may need to rewatch it. I know I kind of fire hosed you with a bunch of information, but I also want to take this opportunity to invite you into the VIP session that we are holding. If you're watching this live, then I'm inviting you into the live VIP session that is on Saturday, May 17th. If you're watching this later, the VIP package includes all the replays of the summit. It also includes a workbook that I've designed that really kind of breaks down these 7 S's, takes the information from the experts and helps you develop a plan that's really going to help support you, right? And help you learn how to best support your system and your nervous system, whether that's through building up your energetic resources or that's learning the tools and practices, going through all the 7 S's so you can figure out what's the right plan to help you make this perimenopause journey the best that it can be. All right. Thanks for watching.